I don't know. I'm a bigger fan. I think Revival was better than Kamikaze, but Kamikaze was fun as shit. He's got his persona. He's got to keep up. But yeah, I'm with you on that. Again, he's not God or anything. He's gonna make some trash. He's gonna make some brilliant shit mixed in there. That's how this goes, right? Nature. It's the nature of the beast. Dude, Rap God is a fucking good song. It is. No one's joining us today, by the way. So far, nobody. Not a single fucking person. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a function. It's less a function of him at that point, and more a function of what's around him. Because the producers he's able to work with are some of the best. He's able to hear the up and comers and pull them in. Like again, keep an eye. I always do. It's keep an eye on the producers on all of these major stars' fucking albums because the next thing they do is going to be interesting. Generally speaking. Mm-hmm. Not disagreeing. Not disagreeing at all. Always loved wordplay. But did you by the way? Because we haven't even talked about the Kendrick Drake beef. Did you pay attention to all that? I usually I dig it because I like when it's done right, and Kendrick has a handful of lines that are like he's generally very good, but that are like fucking just bangers. Like he's worth checking out. All right, I do want to move us forward because if it is just going to be us, I actually think this could be interesting. Fucking no one ever joined. No one. We never have a just a Jack and a Brooks reading of AO. But hey, what are we gonna do, right? It's been a while. I think we had one some time back, but I'm actually okay with that because I want to spend some time on this upcoming paragraph because there's a lot happening in here. There's a lot happening in here, to say the least. And oh, the sort of setup. I'll go ahead and kick us off for the recording. Say, hey everyone, how are you doing? Welcome to the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. Not missing a beat. We are what 2/3 of the way, 3/4 of the way through our third reading of AO, our third reading explanation. Is that about right? We are. Uh, and then we'll be able to start our fourth reading, which will be lovely. Um, I mean, it's fairly accurate. Um, yeah. But we've been diving really hard through the nature of the despotic mode of kind of production in general, how it operates, how repression works inside of it, and how it's sort of built, sort of as a thing. Oh, Lily's in YouTube chat today. That's you're always welcome to join, Lily. But um, this will be fun. I know. We actually have people talking in it now, which is nice. Um, so we've been spending just fucking so much time as we sort of went through the nature of how representation has shifted from the Earth Socius to that of inscription, the despotic Socius. This overarching sort of move from one place to another, how the differences work, how desire is manipulated by it, or sort of plays into it, or produces it and then gets manipulated by it. All the wordings can work, and we're about to get into the the section last time around we went through this. We started talking through the Asiatic means of production and what these things sort of mean to Marx, but also to who comes up in this paragraph, Wittfogel, and then of course Kafka. There is so much like literally history bullshit and literature bullshit inside of this next. It's 2 or 3 paragraphs, but the reality is it is really one paragraph in the original French. So it's going to be a lot to go through, and I want to actually go through it detail by detail. If you don't mind doing it this time with me, Jack, how's that sound? I have found my way through some Wittfogel. So, um, okay, how you doing? So I figure I'll just jump in. We'll get this first paragraph out of the way so we can discuss some Wittfogel and the theories behind it and how he operates, which is one of the reasons they keep using the term Oriental despotism. It's Oriental means a production. Like there's a lot of Orientalism in some of the language of how these people talk, but that's just the way it works. So with that, I'll probably just dive straight in. We'll just do it. One might think that the system of imperial representation was, in spite of everything, milder than that of territorial representation. The signs are no longer inscribed in the flesh itself, but on stones, parchments, pieces of currency, and lists. According to Wittfogel's law of diminishing administrative returns, wide sectors are left autonomous insofar as they do not compromise the power of the state. The eye no longer extracts a surplus value from the spectacle of suffering. It has ceased to evaluate. It has begun rather to forewarn and keep watch, to see that no surplus value escapes the overcoating of the despotic machine. For all the organs and their functions experience a detachment and elevation that relates them to, and makes them converge on, the full body of the despot. In point of fact, the regime is not milder. The system of terror has replaced the system of cruelty. The old cruelty persists, especially in the autonomous or quasi-autonomous sectors, but it is now bricked into the state apparatus, which at times organizes it and at other times tolerates or limits it, in order to make it serve the ends of the state, to subsume it under the higher superimposed unity of a law that is more terrible. As a matter of fact, the law's opposition or apparent opposition to despotism comes late, when the state presents itself as an apparent peacemaker between classes that become distinct from the state. Making it necessary for the latter to reshape its form of sovereignty. Wittfogel's work is actually really fascinating. Go ahead. Oh yeah, let's dive down. Regarding the transition from a royal system of justice based on magical religious speech to a city-state system of justice based on speech as dialogue, and regarding change in sovereignty that corresponds to the transition, see Garnett, his book in the Annual Sociological Issue, 1948, Volume 19, where he goes over this with Michel Foucault as well. All right, Jack, what did you want to say about that? Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, sovereignty is going to be really important to this. The state is going to be important, how it functions, but the bureaucracy is actually, I think, significantly more centered than I've given it credit before. Like our first reading, I didn't give it as much credit. But Wittfogel, just to very shortly go through kind of what Wittfogel wrote about, his specialty was talking about what you might call Mesopotamia, China, like Egypt, in a lot of regions, but particularly how regions are shaped by their primary resourcing. And by primary resourcing, the ones he focused on were focused on water. Specifically, water as sort of the bedrock, the management of water as the bedrock of the entire social order. I mean, Egypt, for example, the Nile, easy. But in China, the management of complicated water systems This is true of Greece. This is true of Rome. This is true of a lot of areas actually around the Middle East towards Asia. The management of water and the systems around that is actually one of the big sort of drivers behind what he saw as this push towards a despot, a singular person in charge, because the complicated needs of, rice paddy fields, for example. It's not just a thing like you can just siphon water off for your own paddy and then you've got your water. It's got to be part of a larger system in order to be sustainable or usable. This is true of a lot of different versions of how water sort of became centered in a lot of these cultures. To him, he noticed that the focus of the bureaucracy tended to be on the things most important to the state. Sort of makes sense in and of itself. But the other half of that, and that's what they're talking about here, diminishing administrative returns, what would happen is the things that were most important, the despot would place his best people on or have more focus on. But the things that were less important, he would create a bureaucratic sort of hierarchy that naturally allowed a distance, even though it may seem like there's more stuff focused on it. Hey, how do we handle trade tariffs with other countries? Oh, there's layers and layers of people. But the diminishing administrative returns, the way he talks about it, is that at some point, having a lot of bureaucracy actually creates almost its own freedom of the sector. So they end up becoming autonomous despite being layered within the bureaucracy because they're actually further away from sort of where the despot's position is. Does that explanation make sense, Jack, as I say it? Because that's like the closest I can come to like summarizing the work, but it's, I think, the thing he's talking about here. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The way that it operates is one of the things they're sort of talking about here, because the bureaucratic system, again, think of it from the position of the hierarchy of power. The things that are most important, he will have closer ties to. Think of how American president, for example, just naturally has very close ties to the defense industry. There's not actually very much bureaucracy between him and a defense contractor. In fact, there's very few people in between. Oh no, they couldn't hear you, Jack, in YouTube. One sec. Fuck. It is. Give me 2 seconds to figure out what the fuck. I'm sure you're clearly upset. I can hear you being very upset that you're not. Yeah, now they're gonna be like, God damn it, Brooks, can you turn his voice back off?
Yeah, we were doing so well.
There it is. Every time I install, it's NVIDIA, man. Every time I install graphics drivers, it adds in the NVIDIA, like, it thinks I want to listen to stuff through my screens. I don't, it makes no sense. It's like, why would you ever pick a screen as your default thing? Some people I get may have that, but I don't know why it's the default.
Yeah, me, buddy.
Anyway, I know they can hear you now. To sort of restate what you were saying, though, just because they did miss it, it's kind of important. The nature of bureaucratic institutions is the despot, the person has the most control and connection to the things that are the most important. But in order to sort of maintain control overall, there is a bureaucratic state that lays out. So how many people are between the American president and the defense contractors? Very few people. They're almost directly connected. How many people are between Joe Biden and, I don't know, the nail polish industry? Like, actually a fuck ton of people. It's a shit ton of people, but it ends up creating this sort of odd, almost reverse reality where those groupings, those bureaucrats are actually significantly divorced from the actual will of the despot or direct connection to him. And it changes the setup there. Because as before, they talked about before, the carving of the body is what sort of determines what's going to happen and who's going to do it. But now we have this really odd thing where these excesses, these other bits that are there, are watching out. They're trying to implement the despot. They're doing what they think the despot wants, despite not being super connected to him, and also not. Joe Biden's never put nail polish in a speech, for example. So those parts of the industry that have those parts of industry, those parts of the state that are not directly connected, have a really unique, seemingly, I want to say quasi-autonomous, I think is the right phrasing of it, a quasi-autonomous sector, as they say, but it's actually not autonomous. It's still part of it. It's bricked into the state apparatus, as they say. At times organizes it, at other times tolerates or limits it. This is the old cruelty that's part of this bureaucracy, that is built into these things. Wittfogel did a huge amount of work on understanding how sort of the way that water is managed set how the rest of the state operates and how necessarily the despot sort of operates. It's primarily, I think, where they spend their time when they talk about the Oriental production, when they use these phrases that Marx, I think, used twice. Wittfogel uses it all the time. His books, I think, even called that. So I'm pretty sure that's his thing that they're taking it from.
That could be, but I want to go back because I think
Please.
for me, I'm reading a little bit differently. Like, I don't think it's the proximity to the despot at the top. I think it's the way the state itself is upon the body of the despot, right? Because I think what the state is relative to the despot is worth keeping in mind here, right? On one hand, you've got the despot providing the full body of production. On the other hand, you have the state that they've defined through three sectors, right? Which includes kind of, I guess I call them the people of the earth, but it includes the like the workers, right? The people who are tending the earth and all of that. Because I think for me, like that point is kind of like you've got two perspectives sitting here. You've got a perspective by which people are acting, and you've got a perspective. So you've got a perspective by which people are acting through disjunctions, one of which is kind of general social production, and another of which is a paralogism, right? And I think that's how this is getting meshed together is we're putting that second, this paragraph's more with the third synthesis, funnily enough, but they're connecting how the second synthesis is functioning in social production with how the state is involved with a paralogistic use. Because this point about law, I think gets at this idea that, what's happening here is Newman is hitting voluptus, right? So the law of the Father is filling in here to provide this kind of transcendent unity, to provide, um, to provide the exclusive disjunctions um, in a seemingly unconditioned way that are now affecting subjectivity by way that through this downstream from this transcendence in a sense, you get the eye changing from direct observance to a kind of watchfulness,
A
right? Like a
watchfulness,
kind of
an
releasing
awareness, a
almost.
need to be constantly aware.
Well, and a terror about that, right?
Yes.
So on one hand, it's observing the cruelty of bringing bringing the semiotics to the body, so to speak, right? And putting them as intimate as one can in a sense. Now it's watching out, right? And watching out in the
Well,
direct
and
sense of it's looking out, right?
yes, well, and
Worried.
this is why I put emphasis on the bureaucratic system. So the way that the Earth Socius inscribes in us and creates what we might call laws now, the law that you don't commit incest, the law that you don't eat your own kill. Those things aren't really laws as we describe them. They're more or less directly written into the flesh, seen by everyone, and everyone is sort of bonded by this, theater of cruelty, as they call it. The shift happens where now, since we have the despot, we're no longer having things inscribed in us. Now laws are written on parchment, laws are written on stone, as they say, and they're not a central thing that, like, oh, there's the laws, all of us are able to literally see the same thing. Just like in the United States, we all have to go travel to see the original Constitution or to read it. Like, we don't see it in the same way. It's not inscribed in us. Instead, these pieces are dispersed, but they're dispersed through the bureaucracy of the state. And as such, we no longer have desire sort of directly up against, what our is the sort of the inscription. It isn't the same. I don't want to say imminent experience, but it's not within the first uh, uh, syntheses. It's now, as they've talked about, it's within the second that these things start taking shifts. So by having this large bureaucratic administration, you end up in this really odd position where the subjects of everything, the people sort of around, they aren't, uh, you know, experiencing the theater of cruelty immediately taken by desire, but instead they're paranoiac, their paranoiac status of, okay, what are the rules? What are the laws? What's going on? What's the next edict? Ready for the next thing to sort of come down the pipe constantly. Ready for that setup, um, combined with the village perverts, as they talked about, the perverts going sort of town to town to town, who are distributing the law of the despot. This combination is that bureaucratic paranoia that sort of comes with it, and I see as central to what they're talking about here.
Yeah, so following from the bureaucracy side, right?
Mhm.
So like this is like the semi-autonomy, right? Is, you know, uh, to make it simple, we can kind of think of these as institutions, but it's not exclusively institutions, right? This could easily be an organization of farmers. Um,
Yes.
this could easily be like a village, right? Because this is, again, the state is for them defined as including, the people working the land as much as, like your kind of middle class, kind of bourgeois, I guess, for lack of a better term, right now, as much as the despot. So it's actually an oddly inclusive state, funnily enough. But in
Deeply
that
so.
in that
Yeah.
s- yeah, yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? Because
Well, it has to
it's an
be.
inclusive
It's
state for an exclusive disjunction,
it's
right? So
inclusive
it's
because everyone has to be in it. That's part of the paranoiac situation, is everyone has to be a member.
well, it's condensing, right? So
Hmm.
you're taking all this kind of horizontal stuff on the earth and you're condensing it into a triangle, right?
Yes. Well, and one of the things I talk about, and we'll get into the next paragraph. All of this is technically one really really large paragraph that's been broken up. Um, the 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 theater of cruelty, the system of cruelty that now has sort of dealt with and given us the way that these laws operate. Um, the law is part and parcel of despotism. We, especially in the post Enlightenment era, but in modern Western thought, we see the law as restricting the despot, as restricting the government, as restricting the power over us that people have. And it's just not the case that this is where it began. Later down the road, as they say, the law's opposition or apparent opposition to despotism, apparent being the operative word, when the state presents itself as an apparent peacemaker between classes that become distinct from the state, making it necessary for the latter to reshape its form of sovereignty. We're not there yet. Like they're like, this is despotism operates very cleanly. Laws are edicts given by the despot to the people, not from the people to the despot.
Can I ask a stupid question? Is there a distinction between the state and the despot? I mean, it sounds like
Yes.
so. What is that distinction?
So the despot is the socius. The state is three pieces of a kind of column that include the despot. So you have the state as, there's the despot at the top, right? there's a middle part that is kind of like your aristocracy, which was the term I was looking for earlier, and there's a bottom which is like your general, just general people. You know, I don't want to put this in proletariat bourgeois terms, but
Yeah, we're not
people
there
who
quite
work
yet.
on the land.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's going to go to caste rather than class, right?
correct.
So I don't want to get like, I don't want to mince the terms.
No, but
Whereas
the
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 despot is just associates.
yeah,
Go ahead, Brooks.
the easy way to think about it is the despot is again the position of king, queen, pharaoh, whatever the position, not necessarily even the person. The state is the apparatus, the bureaucratic apparatus that enacts what the despot desires. Supposedly, it's kind of again, it's not desire in the way we're talking about, but like it's how we commonly think about it. The king has an edict. He wants everyone to be given blue clothing. The state's job is to make sure these things happen one way or another, to ensure the will is carried out. And that what does that mean? It means a billion things. It could mean in one area that they decide that they want to pay for everyone to have blue clothing, in another one they kill everyone who has red clothing. Like there's a lot of shift in that, but the apparatus is the state, and the personage isn't even the important thing. It's the godhead that exists. The despot at the top is a slightly different thing.
Yeah, and to back that up, like the despot's interesting is it has kind of two places there, right? One is socius, one as like the top of the state.
Mhm.
But insofar as it's the top of the state, remember it's the body of the state too. So like, one way I've been thinking about this is like when they talk about his body, it's the body of the empire, right? So like you can think of like China and a dynasty, right? An empire through dynasty. It's not the dynasty itself, it's that the empire pervades. And you have this, constantly new people um, shuffling through the state. But I want to back this up too to this junction, right? Because like when they're talking about the law here, right, from the standpoint of the syntheses, like the way I read that, they're talking about social production's use of the second synthesis
Mhm.
and its misuse of the second synthesis. So like when they're getting into like the law in this sense, right? One of the ways to understand this is that the despot, insofar as it and the state are creating a transcendent use, a seemingly unconditioned use of a disjunction, right? They're creating a double bind, not in the sense of like a superego per se, but a double bind that conditions the other uses of the disjunction, right? So it's like a double bind is created above that is seemingly applied to how social production is using the disjunction. And you get a tension between the two. And this is where like you'll start to get to the displacement of the fourth paralogism.
The phrasing that's important for the next paragraph, the one sentence I do think is worth going back over, is the line where he says, "The old cruelty persists, especially in the autonomous or quasi-autonomous sectors, but it is now bricked into the state apparatus, which at times organizes it and at other times tolerates or limits it." The the dispersed diaspora nature of the state. Again, the despot cannot be everywhere, but the despotic social production has to be everywhere. As that happens, those quasi-autonomous sectors I was talking about earlier, again, the ones where the despot perhaps doesn't have his eye on it all the time, and so therefore the bureaucracy grows, or they do their own sort of things. It's going to be important, I think, especially when we get to capital, because again, the functioning of the bureaucracy is kind of the point. Um, the way that cruelty now rears its head is in those sectors. It's in the parts where the despot isn't necessarily, laying down rules. He isn't necessarily overseeing sort of every step of the way. And so the cruelty now shows up again. And this is, as we talked about, this is where the eye is no longer that of one taking in the cruelty, but now watching out for it, careful for it, terrified of it. And that terror is really, really important to state production because, again, if you're out of the eye of the despot, It isn't like the Eye of Sauron, who's only looking in one direction in a while, but his entire army of people and the bureaucracy that's enforcing, quote unquote, the despot's laws. And that law, how it works, how it plays out, is significant. I'm going to read the next paragraph because I want to get to it. Go ahead, Jack, real quick.
Before you do, I want to peel this back more, right? Because like,
Because we might
to
as
that
well,
end,
just mentioning, we should discuss before we go into it also the penal colony, Kafka. So that'll be fine too.
yeah. Before we do that though, so I want to peel this back more, right? So like with this point about cruelty and terror, right? So notice the I is now taking on two roles. It's taking on a role of like of witnessing and doing the jump for the cruelty,
Mhm.
right? Which I think is a kind of celibate machine. So we're talking about voluptus here, right? We're talking about subjectivity and so forth. We're talking about territoriality because with these semi-autonomous zones, right? I mean, we're talking about the territories themselves, which is why, like, when I say institution, like, it could also be a village. It could be a kind of municipality. The thing with the despot, right, is like, whether or not the king's present, the despot is necessarily present because everything is upon the body of the despot as a socius, right? So we're peeling back to see these semi-autonomous zones are territories upon the despot, right? Putting that in connection with the earth so it can overcode them or overlayer them, we might say. Because as we're going through this, right, what we're kind of lining up here in kind of like a sense of pool, right, is a shot that gives us what kind of subjectivity, what kind of voluptus,
Mhm.
the way the intensities are going to radiate outward through this kind of terror that is constituted by introduction of the transcendent use of the second synthesis, right? How does the double bind as Newman affect the subjectivities that Newman empowers into voluptus, right? That's like the central problem going on right now.
And it's important to remember as we talk about this, just to jump on the back of that, when we are talking about a socialist other than capital, you don't understand what it was like to be a subject in that time. It's not Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure where you go back and everyone thinks and behaves exactly like you do, and your subjectivity is spot on. That there is an entire different type of existence during these times, and it is deeply important to be able to understand that we are talking about going back and specifically looking at these through a handful of lenses so we're able to better discern how existence operated than us standing here from our position and presuming everything is as it always was. And it's very much what you're getting at, Jack, and I just want to, because it is worth mentioning again. One of the tough parts. It's a tough thing to do. I get it. It's a tough thing to do, but it's spot on. We want to talk about Kafka. It's if you haven't read Kafka, the next paragraph's a toughie, to say the least. So it's worth going over a little bit of In the Penal Colony. Do you want to do the summary, or do you care if I do?
Be just.
Yeah.
That's the summary. Be just.
So In the Penal Colony is Kafka, generally speaking, really, really did some wonderful work writing about like what the nature of bureaucracy feels like, in a very magical realism, extraordinary way. I highly recommend reading everything, not just Metamorphosis, but obviously Metamorphosis as well. In the Penal Colony is a darker, particular storyline. The setup is pretty simple. Guy's traveling around the world, and he comes upon this penal colony, and the penal colony is pretty unique. The guy in charge has this machine, and what the machine does is any prisoner who's condemned to death, the machine tortures would be the wrong word, but the person is strapped down, and someone writes a sentence, like literally writes their sentence. I think their sentence that they sentence them quite literally with blades. And then the machine, over the course of a day, rewrites that sentence into them until they die. Is that, if memory serves, is that about right, Jack?
Yeah. The one funny thing about it is, so the actual administration of the colony actually kind of wants to get rid of the machine,
Yeah, well,
and it's the guy
I'm
who
just the machine
caretates
itself.
that wants to keep it going.
Yeah, the machine
Well, no, but
itself.
that's like
And
that's
the,
the funny thing about it.
and the machine itself is complicated. It's not one person running it. There's a lot of people involved. And ultimately, the idea is that they've always noticed, as they say, that people who've gone through this machine, if we've executed someone this way, they've had an epiphany that by the end of it, the pain and the torture is so great, they've realized their sins. They've come to understand what they did wrong, and this epiphany actually saves them. Or at least this is what the dude in charge of the penal colony believes. As again, as Jack said, not everyone's super thrilled about this thing that basically tortures people as they scream for an entire day. And the point of the story at this point is to very much talk about sort of the process we have of how we basically torture, execute, whatever it is, but how people sort of exist under these patterns that if you work hard enough, if you torture yourself long enough, whatever it is, the idea that suffering builds character. This is like the most extreme version of that. Well, inevitably, new guy comes in charge of the prison, the commandant, who absolutely worships this very, very obvious symbol of bureaucracy, and the prison industrial complex. They tell him, "We're getting rid of the machine. This is the last execution is today." He's bereft. He cannot believe they're doing this, but because he believes in this machine so much. So as they're taking the condemned to it, he throws the guy out, pulls the guy out, and puts himself in and turns the machine on. But the machine doesn't slowly torture him over the course of 12 or so many hours. The machine malfunctions and just like cuts him into pieces, and he's dead. And he dies just a brutal, awful death. That's the story. That's the uplifting Kafka story of the day. That's something for you to enjoy over lunch or in the evening, depending on where you're at. It's dark. It's important to know this because they're about to sort of break it apart and talk through these things. So I want to get to the paragraph and then we'll kind of do a deeper dive, if that's all right with everyone. All right.
Yeah, sure.
The law does not begin by being what it will become or seek to become later. A guarantee against despotism, an immanent principle that unites the parts into a whole, that makes of this whole the object of a general knowledge and will whose sanctions are merely derivative of a judgment and an application directed at the rebellious parts. The imperial barbarian law possesses instead two features that are in opposition to those just mentioned. The two features that Kafka so forcefully developed. First, the paranoiac schizoid trait of the law, metonymy, according to which the law governs non-totalizable and non-totalized parts, partitioning them off, organizing them as bricks, measuring their distance, forbidding their communication, henceforth acting in the name of a formidable but formal and empty unity, immanent, distributive, not collective. And second, the maniacal depressive trait, metaphor, according to which the law reveals nothing, has no knowable object, the verdict having no existence prior to the penalty, the statement of the law having no existence prior to the verdict. The trial by ordeal presents these two traits in a raw state. As in the machine of, in the penal colony, it is the penalty that writes both the verdict and the rule that has been broken, the sentence on the skin. In vain did the body liberate itself from its characteristic graphism in the system of connotation, for it now becomes the stone and the paper, the tablet and the currency on which the new writing is able to mark its figures, its phonetism, and its alphabet. Overcoding is the essence of the law and the origin of the new sufferings of the body. Punishment has ceased to be a festive occasion from which the eye extracts a surplus value in the magic triangle of alliance and filiations. Punishment becomes a vengeance, the vengeance of the voice, the hand, and the eye now joined together on the despot, the vengeance of the new alliance, whose public character does not spoil the secret. I will bring down upon you the avenging sword of the vengeance of alliance. For once again, before it becomes a feigned guarantee against despotism, the law is the invention of the despot himself. It is the juridical form assumed by the infinite debt. The jurist will be seen in the despot's procession up to the time of the late Roman emperors, and the juridical form will accompany the imperial formation, the legislator alongside the monster, Gaius and Commodus, Opinion and Caracalla, Ulpian and Heliogabalus, the delirium of the 12 Caesars and the golden age of the Roman law, taking the debtor's side against the creditor when necessary so as to consolidate an infinite debt. A lot going on. God, there's so much to talk about. There's a reason that I know they cut this into 2 paragraphs. This is supposed to be a continuation of the previous, so I'm not quite sure where you want to start with it, Jack, because we can kind of take bit by bit. I think there's actually just an exceptionally large amount of things happening in this paragraph. I don't think we can really summarize it. And normally I'd take a crack, but I'm not gonna.
Yeah. So it's doing what I was just describing between like a transcendent use of Newman in tension with social production in general, right? And the way that that empowers a voluptus through terror, right? That's what's getting developed here, in a lot of fucking words, but uh, in a lot of words, that's the general theme of the paragraph. So like this whole point about terror, right, is that terror is it's the intensification for the territories for the celibate machine. And remember, voluptus is kind of like this mixture of what happens in Newman through whatever uses of Newman are going on, whether they're miraculous or they're condensing, right? Whether they're schizoid or paranoiac, they're schizoid paranoiac for voluptus. They're intention for subjectivity. So like as they build this out, I'm gonna skip to the middle and we can walk back. Like the 2 features that Kafka so forcefully developed, the paranoiac schizoid trait. So notice how it's both of the law metonymy, according to which the law governs non-totalizable and non-totalized parts, partition them off, organizing them as Brits, measuring their distance and forbidding their communication. So this is about how metonymy affects the multiplicity, right? Affects the group.
And it's also the creation of metonymy in general. Just, I mean, it's part of this is sort of, it's the double action. It's the creation of these elements that allow this type of thought. Metonymy specifically is the naming of a thing in place of the thing itself. Like if we use the word, hey, do you have a Band-Aid? That's a brand of adhesive strip, but we use the term Band-Aid as metonymy. We commonly use the word closely associated. Then the nature of the paranoid schizoid trait, especially within how language has sort of shifted and become, again, oh, what's that? It's water. Now we have metonymy within the laws and the creation of these things. Because it's partitioning, creating, placing, totalizing. No?
Well, let's go back to the partitioning thing, right? Because so yeah, I like your examples of metonymy, right? Like what it's giving you is it's a way of taking differences and rejiggering them through a kind of difference,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's it's both miraculous and it's condensing. It's kind of creating something new, a new kind of usage, right? It might create some inclusive disjunctions, but it's also condensing them at the same time, right? And that's kind of that paranoia side. So you're getting what's funny about it is you're getting an expansiveness and a condensing that
Definitely. Absolutely. And it functions. We can even find examples. An example I think fits. You tell me if I'm wrong on this. An example I think fits is the fact that in our bureaucracy today, for example, The way that it's a famous one now. If you haven't watched the episode John Oliver did on it, but packaged salads aren't regulated by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, because that's for food for sale. It's instead agriculture. It's agriculture, not food, because of the way that it's created. Those are two elements, and there is actually no they mean this. I think they mean this very directly, that these organizing these elements as bricks, measuring their distance, forbidding their communication, quite literally. Those are two aspects of the bureaucracy that are not permitted to connect and to have conversation. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about breaking down everything in law into these different groups, totalizing them, organizing them, and basically acting in the name of a formidable but formal and empty unity that is not ultimately collective. Is that a fair example?
Yeah, I mean, it goes both ways, right? So you can call a salad agriculture, right? But it's also now going to get treated as agriculture. So, this is kind of that condensing and that miraculous bit, right? To your point, is it's condensing it in the sense of, a kind of, a word for a word, if you like, right? A word replacing a word by relation to it. But it's also expanding it in terms of like what it can do now. It's kind of the paradox of it. So if a salad is agriculture, it gets treated as agriculture, right? But it may then become something else later on.
Yes, very much. Well, and this is the second thing that happens here when he talks about uh, the metaphor, according to which the law reveals nothing and has no knowable object. The law with agriculture isn't talking about salads. It's talking about that thing. It's this grouping. So there's this really fucked up double play that, again, Kafka through his writing is super fucking good at. That not only does the law and the bureaucracy break things up into individualized parts, but it doesn't give a fuck about the parts. Each of those individualized things is the larger thing. It is metaphorically these larger elements. And there is sort of nothing exists until it has to be classified. It is classified immediately, didn't exist prior to that. And it's this really fucked up process for the whole thing. Like the law reveals nothing, no knowable object, the verdict having no existence prior to the verdict. And this sort of really odd interplay of how these things are sort of done as they go is sort of the nature of despotic law formation. No? Maybe? A little bit? Sort of? Not really?
Uh, yeah, to walk this out more, right? Like, so with metaphor is about putting something in terms of something else to bridge a gap, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like the kind of joke they're making is that it's not by a higher knowledge that's happening, right? So the likeness is not based on a higher knowledge. So it's kind of joking about paranoiac knowledge here. Um, to that end, right, the likeness is based on, um, basically, it's based on so matching a verdict which does not precede the penalty to a penalty, matching a kind of statement that does not precede a verdict to a verdict, right? So, it's kind of like putting something in terms of another thing so as to constitute the verdict by which the sentencing and so forth can happen. And you get the two, so you get metonymy and metaphor the way you get alliance and affiliation in a sense. These become two poles for a kind of disjunction.
Yes, I think also, though, there is early work being done specifically right here in this paragraph as we're laying out the question that at some point I have a feeling JK will ask today or next week. So wait, do we have Oedipus yet? And this is another bit of that process that is starting to appear. We didn't have metonymy and metaphor weren't things that could possibly operate underneath the inscription of the earth, the way that earth inscriptions worked, is they were sort of polyvocal and able to sort of be contingent and shift. It's not the case here. These things don't have that ability. The written word, how it operates, because it is coming from the despot down, the order of things. This is now you are now water people. This is water. You need to transport water to this other town. You have to do it in these jugs, uh, and we're going to say they're barrels. And barrels is a measurement. You deliver 27 barrels a day. That's your day. Like this setup creates a place where we have metonymy actually showing up for the first time as like a linguistic element, that you have this trait of the law where we have the thing being mistaken or the word being used for the thing that's somewhat like it. So when we say barrels, we may not mean any sized barrels. It's actually a particular measurement of barrels, and we now use the word in place of it because, again, this is the despot has said this is how it works. Metaphorically, of course, he's also speaking because until the rules come around, we have to figure out what matters because of the same paranoiac eye we were talking about before. Everything has to fit in somewhere. Everything has to. And so when something needs to be judged, where does it fit? We have to place it somewhere. So it has to be this maniacal depressive trait, the metaphor, because the verdict has no existence. The law knows nothing. It's this dumb bunch of dumb motherfuckers. So ultimately, we need to be always overcoding always everything. And this is where metaphor comes into play for the first time as well.
Yeah, I mean the law is doing the overcoding, right? So it's creating. So one of the things the double bind is giving us, right, is it's creating like the signs in the Saussurian sense, as they said, right? So we're getting this sense in which signifier and signified have come forth, and in a sense in which they two of the things they do, right, keeping with the spirit of disjunction, is metaphor and metonymy, right? Because with metaphor and metonymy, we're getting this link between Newman and voluptus, right? Because the overcoding corresponds to the terror the way that the coding corresponds to the cruelty, right? Because what this eye is kind of doing is kind of twofold. It's making sure things don't stay to the earth in a sense so that the coding remains uncoded. It's also going to make sure that things don't kind of escape to the BWO, right?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. What's up,
So,
JK?
yeah, so is the whole point of this paragraph saying that the law, sort of like pretends to be, neutral or at least representative of people, but it's really not. It is, law is derived from the despot, and the example of the Roman, this list of Roman, this is a list of Roman emperors
It is.
alongside monsters.
Yes.
And so they're representative of this kind of law that pretends to be law that represents the people, but it's really they are the despots who are, who are making the law. And it
Well,
is the law of vengeance, right? And
it's
also is this kind of a process of despotism is what creates Oedipus. You asked, just coming back to that. So is it the kind of overcoding that is the castration process of that takes place, uh, you know, by the despot, and so that's how perhaps that's how Oedipus comes about.
I I think that's a bit of a liberty, right? Like even with the tension between the law for the despot versus like say the common people, right? Like I don't think they're making a comment about how equitable is the law between the despot, the aristocrat, and the like the people themselves at a general level. I think it's more about how this 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 double bind affects all of them, right? And yet all of them are constitutive of the state. So it's not. I don't think it's a point about like social equity. I think it's a point about how because the people are in that state too, right? They're This isn't a point about like how they participate in democracy. This is a point about how their constitution is tied up in the state itself, so that they can't be disadvantaged by the state by virtue of not belonging to the state,
I'm
right?
I'm gonna agree, but I'm also gonna disagree because I think what you're saying is spot on, Jack. But I think there is a way. So when we talk about a lot of the stuff they're saying here, law, metaphor, metonymy, these are terms straight out of Lacan. Like Lacan went really deep in a handful of these things in the unconscious. And when we're talking about the law and equity, let's pull back a little bit. Let's say we have a guy named Lacan who says that actually the way the unconscious operates and how to be healthy is to really understand the way that you deal with the law in general. You know, your father, the father is the law. And the way that you develop meaning is from understanding the law. Here's how the law works. And this guy says all these things. But what he's doing is he's actually taking like a particular contingent way that the law operated and sort of operates now and pretending that that's a priori reality for all of us. They're saying, no. Break things apart. Let's talk about how people actually exist in their subjectivities over time. And maybe we can start to see that the formation of these elements that, now we have Oedipus. Oedipus requires the father who does the law. It requires us to have the ability to have or think of things metaphorically like that. Oh, your father. Oh, father lays down the law. Father doesn't lay down anything, but that's a metaphor. But we can't do that. Oh, when we speak metonomically, and I'm saying, oh, well, father will be home soon. If I say it as a joke, I mean daddy law, father justice, mother justice, whatever it is. All of these things are metonymical. And the process that Oedipus will go through under capital in order to produce the subjectivity that is us is the ability to sort of have all of these social elements pulled in and for us to look at things metaphorically, metonymically, replacing things, having representation take another turn. The parts are starting to show up. This is not the same, though, and it is not an emergent thing that is a priori. Their point is, because of the nature of how despots, dictators, the centralized state apparatus that formed around and a handful of others, the way that they functioned necessarily meant that, sure, the despot could be in this corner of the kingdom having a conversation with people and, laying down his law, but everywhere else, the written word of things needed to mean something. He couldn't speak towards every contingent reality. If he said, excellent, lettuce will be free to all. What kind of lettuce? Are we talking about red lettuce, green lettuce? Is it all greens? Does spinach count? That thing that is being said needed to be able to be interpreted by people, because people are terrified of not doing the right thing, because Jesus fucking Christ, they did really awful shit to people who did the wrong thing. So you don't want to do that. So you're trying to constantly ascertain what the king or what the law is and how it actually operates. And so as people did that, as people sort of worked through, oh, he means this metaphorically, or this word he means metonymically, we finally have that actually operating. Now, it doesn't take the next few steps. As Jack is saying, this is very much just like the Earth socius really kind of stopped at the connective syntheses and disjunction was sort of almost consumed immediate. Now we have this second step where we have this odd play and interplay of the way representation works. If I were to say, bring me water, you would bring me any water. But obviously, I mean metaphorically or metonymically, a very particular thing, don't I? Well, that's what you've got to figure out. And in this space, there isn't room for that. So they're trying to deconstruct and take apart the very particular argument Lacan, and Freud as well, but Lacan specifically, was making about the nature of the a priori unconscious that worked symbolically through master signifiers, and you found metonymical and metaphorical use through that master signifier. their argument here, as I read it, is, yeah, this is where that is. And by the way, it ain't like that anymore. So here's where like the despotic nightmare that you believe our unconscious is, here's where that actually works. And by the way, it's not the case anymore. So that's how I read this part and how we sort of lead into ultimately Oedipus. Sorry for the ramble.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is like this is not a terror against people. This is a terror of the despot against the earth, right? It is a terror against cruelty. Um, I don't think it's a question of like people in their peoplehood per se. I think it's a question of how subjectivity itself depends on, at least in this context, depends on how the double bind is affecting
Right.
the actual
I'm agreeing with
exchanges.
you. That's the thing is I'm agreeing. I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I think what they're talking about specifically in this, when we're talking about people at the time, like if we're talking about the text itself, they're talking about this is how subjectivity is affected and generated by the processes that we've laid out. But, and I think JK's leaning into it because I see it too. There is a very clear critique of Lacan and psychoanalysis happening just in this paragraph because of the use of metaphor metonymy and these other elements that are showing up. So, and they're doing both, like they do both throughout the entire book. So that's what I'm saying is, Jack, I think you're spot on right. I think there is an undercurrent of other critiques that they're prepping and sort of positioning as we get going, but not quite yet. Does that make sense?
Uh, I mean, yeah, it could be Lacan at the same time. Like Lacan to social equity is kind of two different points, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, it is. But again, I think there's play happening in this paragraph where if that's the again, and we should let JK answer because I think it is too far, but I think the general direction I think is how I said it. JK, generally, thoughts if you have any.
Yeah, well, look at, that sentence where it says, "But once again, before it becomes a feigned guarantee against despotism, the law is the invention of the despot himself. It is the
Okay.
juridical form assumed by the infinite debt." So, what does that mean? Does that mean that the law is created by the despot, and it is a kind of a pretense, right? A pretext or a pretense of equality or something. But it's well, let's see. So the law is not a guarantee against despotism, but it pretends to be, right?
But so this last little bit here, where they're going back and forth and using the example of the Roman emperors, the back and forth they're talking about is how the nature of the despot or like this overall process, as they say, it isn't necessarily always on the creditor's side. It isn't always necessarily like the example they use of um, Gaius, which I fucking love, look, Caligula and Commodus as two opposing. Caligula, which I think people know more than Gaius, was kind of a piece of shit in some pretty significant ways, I think is fair. He basically, if we're talking about a dictator, the word Caligula is pop culture for a reason. He's fucking nuts and he did awful shit. The opposition there, Commodus, Marcus Aurelius's kid, who I believe is Marcus Aurelius's kid, ruled alongside him. Good dude. Generally kept things in order and stable. This thing that they're talking about, again, the underlying thing that's necessary is the infinite debt that everyone owes all the way up the chain, and ultimately the state, the socius, will take the side it has to in order to maintaining that infinite debt as a thing. It'll be on the side of Aurelius Aurelius's kid, Commodus, the commode guy, which is the word for toilet. Poor dude. Um, the Commodus, where it's like orderly and keeping things going. He wasn't brutal to anyone. He actually wasn't really reviled by many people. We could say boring, actually, would be another way. Like boring, he kept things alive. Versus Caligula, who um, began doing stuff that made everyone really, really happy, and then he became completely nuts and um, became a god, as he called himself, and just killed a bunch of people. Like just brutal asshole. Um, it's kind of is the point. Both sides of these things. These both are able to be it. Instead of considering in opposition to that, oh, look at how the Romans existed. Their state was up and down. It's like, no, their state was stable because the way that the despotic state operates is for the infinite dead. It doesn't give a fuck at any real point about, is it overly cruel or not. The state, the despotic socius adjusts as necessary in view of and for the infinite debt. Maybe. Yeah, that'd probably be a better way to put it.
Yeah. So the despot cares about debits in order to layer credits atop them, right? That's that's one way to get at overcoding. So like if I read this backwards, it is the juridical form assumed by the infinite debt. So the infinite debt or credit is a ju- assumes a juridical form. So when we find a kind of jury, if you like, we're talking about credit, right? We're talking about the establishment of a disjunction through a new alliance and an extended filiation atop an alliance and affiliation in the earth, right? Reading that backwards a little bit more, despot himself invents the law. So the empire, if we want to substitute a word there and play a little metonymy ourselves, the empire creates the laws. So for me, this isn't like, who do they favor? This is more that the double bind itself that does the overcoding can use the jury to make the credit on top of the debit. So even when it takes the debtor's side, even when it appears to take the side of those from the earth, so to speak, it does so to layer a credit atop that debt.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why like the punishment, the vengeance, right? This is that tension between the despotic and the earth, right? Staving off that which cannot be overcoded or that which would be decoded or uncoded.
Which means that basically the law is a pretense of siding with the debtor in order, but you know, only as a way to maintain its infinite debt means to maintain its power, over the you know over
Well,
those other classes. Yeah.
I think it's less a pretense than that. I think it's more that the 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 jury itself or the court, we would say, if we want to read juridical kind of generally, the court is itself a way of creating credit atop debit. So, you know, I don't think it's like a pretense of who it will side with, who like gets the favor. It's to say that the empire itself uses the court to create credit atop or to layer a credit atop debt. So it's a question of power in the construction of credit on top of debt, not like, how does the priestly caste benefit over the farmers?
Yeah. So the juridical form is created by the despot. So even if you go to court, and it's just a means of maintaining that infinite debt. But it pretends to take the side of the debtors, right? Mm.
but I don't think it's a pretense or a pretend. It's to overcode, right? So what it's against is it's against the earth. It's taking a vengeance upon the earth, right? And
It, it
this is
it
what
does
the eye
side
of law
it does side with the creditor as well other times. Like again, it's the the
can.
the phrasing of this that's I think really important is the little bit before. Punishment has ceased to be a festive occasion from which the eye extracts a surplus value in the magic triangle of alliance and filiations. That sentence, let's go back, talk about the earth socius and a child who's who's done stuff, whatever it may be, as they've grown, they're being punished, I think is a fair way to put it, by having their fucking skin carved or tattooed or all of the, generally horrifying ways that pain mixed with it and people watching. But it wasn't a punishment in terms of like, we're going to punish you. Vengeance will be visited. God's law you violated. It's instead, it was festive in a really fucking weird way. Even when you talk about someone like the Aztecs who would brutally murder people that they'd captured from other tribes and sacrifice them. It wasn't punishment. It was punishment, like for sure. Do you want to have your heart like cut up and thrown down a fucking hill or set on fire or flayed alive? Pass on all that shit. But it was festive. It was a not a celebration, but it was within itself sort of the thing happening in and of itself. That now punishment has become a vengeance of voice, hand, and eye joined together in the despot, this new alliance, whose public character does not spoil the secret. I will bring down upon you the avenging sword of the vengeance of alliance. Because, and just to read for a second, once again, before it becomes a feigned guarantee against despotism, the law is the invention of the despot himself. It is the juridical form assumed by the infinite debt. This process of law handed down in order to maintain this infinite debt to the despot, which is the only goal. Only goal. It can take a lot of forms, but again, the subjectivity that's conditioned through this process, the people all over, again, it's not about whether you're a debtor or not. Everyone is in line with this. Everyone is in line with the infinite debt, and it needs to be maintained at any cost. We have to overcode every single thing. It has to be overcoded to become either metanomical, where a word can basically apply wherever it needs to, or metaphorical, where the way that something's described, oh, he really means X. These elements in the law are necessary to sort of fit what is needed in order to maintain the infinite debt. Think of the mass of people, like forget about the upper caste in general, but think about the people. Why don't they rise up? Why don't they do X, Y, and Z? Why don't they do anything? Well, the reason is, in this case, because the way that the law is working, the way that the system works, the way the socius produces them is in line with the infinite debt. The infinite debt is the thing they desire more than anything. And so as such, as they say things, react to things, define laws, decide whether or not to kill everyone who wears red or blue, because that's what was said and what it really means. These things are done in line with understanding that the infinite debt is the primary goal. So it's not the debtors or the creditors. The infinite debt is set. Creditors are irrelevant because we have one real creditor. It's infinite debt. Everyone else, you can't let the creditors get too much power, because if that happens, then the debt won't be infinite. It'll be partitioned to creditors. So we have to do something that breaks that up. I can name a few things that Gaius Caligula did that definitely broke up some creditors, quite literally. Or Commodus, who worked in order to sort of secure creditors against debtors in very unique, but really, you would say, gentle dictatorship ways. This setup sort of back and forth is what's happening and what we're talking through. So it's not that, again, the despot probably doesn't even have goals as far as any of this. The infinite debt isn't interested in one side for the other. It is about the continuation of the system. And this is the thing to bring back to in the penal colony. All that commandant wants is the continuation of the system. The dude believes in the system of this torture device so much that he just wants nothing more than it. And so when you talk about the commandant getting in the machine because it's about to be destroyed in order to experience it himself, in order to have full jouissance, because he can't imagine a world without it, that's everyone's subjectivities. This is the process that people are going through. They want that infinite debt. They want it to exist. Everything is for that. Does that make sense? No? Maybe?
I mean, yeah, again, it's the infinite debt applied to the, the finite debt, right? So, I mean, what the law is doing here is it's another way of talking about overcoding as it's beginning to pertain to voluptus, right? So the use of law as a transcendent double bind, right? As an unconditioned double bind is being used to apply credits to make infinite debt, right? On
Mm-hmm.
top of the debt in the earth that was finite. The finite debts come come into voluptus by way of cruelty, right? Which is where you get the whole celibate machine discussion, and everything. On top of that is a way in which this. I don't think they've sketched out the theater of terror just yet, but that's what they're doing. On top of that, now is a way that terror preoccupies the eye, right? And it does that through overcoding, right? So, like, the subjectivities, right? If we want to kind of think of this, like, what's the intensity's um, kind of base form, right? It's putting cruelty into tension with terror, and the way both of those impact not only subjectivity, but work backwards upon Newman, and since they open up with like the transcendent phallus, right? The multiplicity and the connections.
Is this infinite debt right off from Nietzsche's uh, book on morality? And also, this infinite debt, does that transition to that the description of capitalism, where the whole system is based on infinite debt?
Uh, I think the point about the court being like a kind of debuffer for the state, right? And like the joke about the peacekeeping, I think that's setting up the shot toward capital. Um, but that's getting into like, that's where we need to go to 3.9 to really have that conversation because this is all going to shift, right?
It is going to change. Yeah. Again, we're only in one paragraph right now talking about this transition as they're talking through it. Because again, they're really doing their best to really over explain and really bring through the setup between sort of how over time historically desire has shifted and how it's repressed, how social production has changed. And again, trying to get away from utilizing any transcendental elements to define this, such as, master signifiers, for example, because it's a lot of what they're talking about in this paragraph, and making their move into not talking about the law as how we understand it necessarily today, which is primarily as a way to sort of stave off state power. But instead, no, the law began here. We need to talk about the machines as they're created, the emergent nature of these things. And that's a big push here. And I want to move to the next paragraph because I do want to at least get maybe 2 paragraphs done, which would be lovely. I think that'd be lovely. Any last notes on this one before I push on through?
Uh, whatever interest we have in Nietzsche, it looks like he's in the next paragraph. So
Oh, he is.
yeah, full speed ahead, man.
Oh, he is. I also recommend In the Penal Colony. It's a really lovely read. Anything Nietzsche is pretty much always a really lovely read, but In the Penal Colony will help you understand, if you read it, it'll actually help you grasp a lot more of what they're talking about because I've oversimplified it as we've talked about it here. But the actual reading of it gets into when they talk about how it writes both the verdict and rule that it has been broken, these elements and how they sort of work, it actually does a really nice job of painting it. And Kafka was fucking Kafka, right? But with that, off to some Nietzsche. As vengeance, and a vengeance exercised in advance, the imperial barbarian law crushes the whole primitive interplay of action, the enacted, vagi, and reaction. Passivity must now become the virtue of the subjects attached to the despotic body. As Nietzsche says when he shows precisely how punishment becomes a vengeance in the imperial formations, a tremendous quantity of freedom must have been expelled from the world, or at least from the visible world, and made as it were latent under the hammer blows and artist's violence. There occurs a detachment, an elevation of the death instinct, which ceases to be coded in the interplay of savage actions and reactions, where fatalism was still something where fatalism was still something enacted in order to become the somber agent of overcoding, the detached object that hovers over each subject as though the social machine had come unstuck from its desiring machines. Death, the desire of the despot's desire, a latency inscribed in the bowels of the state apparatus. Better not a sole survivor than for a single organ to flow outside this apparatus or slip away from the body of the despot. This is because there is no other necessity, no other fatum, than that of the signifier in its relationships with its signifieds. Such is the regime of terror. What the law is supposed to signify will only be revealed later, when it has evolved and assumed the new figure that appears to place it in opposition to despotism. But from the beginning, it expresses the imperialism of the signifier that produces its signifieds as effects that are more effective and necessary as they escape knowing, and as they owe all to their imminent cause. Occasionally, it still happens that the young dogs will call for a return to the despotic signifier, without exegesis or interpretation. Well, the law, however, wants to explain what it signifies, to assert an independence of its signified. Against the despot, says the law. For the dogs, according to Kafka's observations, want desire to be firmly wedded in the law of pure detachment and elevation of the death instinct, rather than to hear, it is true, hypocritical doctors explain what it all means. But all that, the development of the democratic signified or the wrapping of the despotic signifier, nevertheless forms part of the same question. Sometimes open, sometimes barred, the same extended abstraction, a repressive machinery that always moves us away from the desiring machines. For there has never been but one state. The question, what is the use of that, fades more and more and disappears in the fog of pessimism, nihilism, nada, nada. This is a very complicated paragraph. They do wrap it up at the end with, I think, their core point, which is the continuing question. What is the use of that? Is something that has disappeared over time, which is a great line. There's so much being said in here. Where do you want to start, Jack?
Sorry, the mute button was fire. I don't know. Let's just take it from the top, I guess, right? So like, so generally speaking, right, this is about how vengeance is different and in relation to cruelty, right? So cruelty and the primitive, as they call it, is a question of action, the enacted, and reaction. So they're outlining the theater of cruelty under a under a metonymy, if you like, but under a different word structure. And what's curious is they then go to passivity now. So the point being that with the theater of cruelty, it's about action, enacting, and reaction, all of which involve action, right? Here they almost like it almost echoes of docility, right? Vengeance is about a subjectivity of passivity, right? So this goes into like, I don't want to over Foucaultianize it, right? But this goes into a
I
sense in
I
which
I love
ter-
I love that you invented a word, just
I
Sokoviizing.
mean,
That sounds like
Foucault,
something that a car
I don't know if I can
dealership would
remember
try
the
to
word.
add on to like a bill. Yeah, we'll
Yeah, man.
Sokoviize it, but it'll be an extra 10%. Sorry,
We
go
can
ahead.
always work in a panopticon, right?
Yeah,
We can always get that feature in there.
always.
Um, yeah, there's a way. Uh, we'll make you docile somehow. But no, to that end, right? So like, and I'll give to somebody else when I finish the sentence. So like in that sense, right? The passive. So cruelty as it works through action. Terror and vengeance here works through passivity. That's kind of the conflict they're kind of um, putting into cooperation as promised.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, this is how the law functions. Again, when we talk about metonymy and metaphor, and the way that terror operates for the subjects created by this, the instead of, again, let's go back to previous socii, the earth, everyone is acting. There's an interplay constantly of everything. It's not so much that a person chooses to do a thing, oh, I'm going to go out and hunt something, but the enacted, the reactive, and the active are all interplaying constantly, and they're acting on themselves. Its desire is acting pretty much instantly. But this can't be the case anymore, because now the theater of terror that exists under the despot, everyone's watching, keeping an eye out. They don't want to be the victim of a thing. They don't want to do anything wrong. They don't want death to visit upon them. And this thing that has happened now makes it so passivity is a virtue. Which you can this piece from Nietzsche. There's a couple places where he says stuff like this. I don't know this specific thing, but it's the idea that freedom has been destroyed underneath hammers, blows, and artists' paintbrushes. The way that this has happened specifically is um, uh, all that crushed means you have to wait and see, wait and be told. You have to be waiting. And you can see this very, I think, clearly in not just, Nietzsche's writings, but if you talk about what are considered the virtues of especially various times over the last 1,000 years, 1,500 years, the virtue of penance, of penitence, of the ability to sort of sit and do nothing, like passivity, studying, waiting, obedience. These things shift. They're not the same. It's not the same. Someone who was passive under the socialists wasn't passive for the same reasons. The subjectivity developed differently, and this is, as they say, they go into, there occurs a detachment and elevation of the death instinct, which ceases to be coded in the interplay of savage actions and reactions, where fatalism was still something enacted in order to become a somber agent of overcoding a detached object. Fucking so many things thrown in there. Um, the death uh, the death instinct that was at interplay is works differently inside of this subjectivity. No longer in the Earth Socius, where it was the interplay of savage actions and reactions, where you would enact fatalism, which is again fate, the inevitability, however you want to sort of phrase it, the necessity of things. If I go out into the woods when it's raining, I'll be wet and I won't be able to hunt as well. Things like that is basic shit. But the death instinct is no longer coded in the interplay of the actions, reactions, and sort of this milieu of back and forth, but now is elevated and detached. And this symbol of overcoding that creates the metonymy, that creates the metaphor, that puts us in a place where we're always trying to figure out where basically death is waiting. This plays everywhere, as though the social machine has become unstuck from its desiring machines. Death, the desire of desire, despot's desire, all these things, they're latent, they're inscribed in the bowels of the apparatus. But it's inscribed there because we cannot allow desire to play anywhere. Desire can't go outside because what if it does a thing that the law wouldn't allow? What if? And that thing has to be stopped. You can't do something that the despot didn't specifically allow. And that's, again, metaphor metonymy and how the law operates. It isn't that he would create a law and people would find ways around it. Today, people interplay with the law all the time. Crypto fucking was founded on this idea of like, oh, you say I can't have securities? Well, I'm not going to call them securities. I am a clever man. We have the entire sovereign citizen movement where people are like, oh, I'm not driving, I'm traveling. Thinking like they can get around the laws because the laws are written in a metaphorical, metonymical sense. It's driving. Driving means the wide elements because it's an edict, because it comes from on top. Law is these things. And anything that's not in the law has to go. Gotta be fucking out. And it's not, again, that you feel this, it's the subjectivity is built in a way that that's just how desire works. You desire the connections, but don't exactly work super well, and the disjunctions will just say, become biunivocal, to put it very lightly. It's better that no one do anything than the slightest bit of desire get out there. And this becomes the way that they start talking about how meaning, again, is made, signification, signifiers. It's really important because there is no other necessity than that of the signifier in its relationships with its signifieds. If they say you cannot drive, you don't get to go, yes, well, I wasn't driving. I had an autopilot on my car. Haha. It's no, you don't get to be clever. The law is the fucking big, wide thing. Metonymical, that's metaphorical. And we have to be ready for that. The signifier matters more than anything else in its relationships with signifieds. What the law is supposed to signify will only be revealed later when it is evolved to assume a new figure that appears its place in opposition to despotism. That what the law is supposed to signify, we have an understanding now, but not then. This was the law. This was the word of God effectively coming down on us, and all of us had to get in line. From the beginning, it expresses the imperialism of the signifier that produces its signifieds as effects that are more effective and necessary as they escape knowing. I'll finish the sentence in a second, I promise. But it's deeply important to grasp this part because, again, the signifier, what is meant by these things, the less it's attached to any specific thing, the more important it is to understand the wide swath. For example, Saudi Arabia, decent example of this. You're not allowed to dance. What does that mean? Like as a thing? I mean, we have a general idea, but if, for example, a bug is on the ground and I'm dancing around trying to get away from it, am I dancing? We use the word for it. The less direct an edict is, oh, you can't swing dance. That would be a very direct, specific setup. That's not how it works. That's why it works this way, because the beginning, it expresses the imperialism of the signifier that produces its signified as effects that are more effective and necessary as they escape knowing. The further away from being very well defined and clear, the more that they really matter to us, the more that they become important. And they owe all, as they owe all, to their imminent cause, not I am an imminent cause. Occasionally it still happens. Young dogs will call for a return to the despotic signifier without reading into it, without thinking about it. Well, the law wants to explain what it signifies, asserting independence is signified against the despot, says the law. I want to go back to the French real quick. Sorry, I just want to read this just so I can make sure I'm getting the wording right, because dogs is an interesting choice here. Sorry, apologies. Interesting. Dogs is, I just want to make sure that they're saying that before I do anything. 2 seconds, sorry. Yeah, they mean fucking dogs. They are. Man. They're talking, they're being very dismissive of of conservatives, of neo-monarchists. I don't know what phrasing you want to use for it, but we see them all the time today. The young dogs who want this setup, they want to return to the despotic signifier without exegesis or interpretation. They don't want they don't want people reading in or breaking things down. They want to get really hard on, this is the rules, this is the setup. The despotic signifier says this is, what is a woman? A woman is this. That's it. They call this, the law wants to actually explain what it signifies, to assert independence of its signified. It says against the despot at that point. The dogs, according to Kafka, the assholes, want desire to be wedded to law in the pure detachment and elevation of the death instinct, rather than to hear the hypocritical doctors explain what it all means. There's a Kafka reference in there. I don't know. Jack, do you know this one? The hypocritical doctors, what it all means?
I don't know. I think about like you see this in the castle. There's people who have to explain what the laws are.
I haven't read The Castle in a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you need to, right? Like, it's just so doctors of the law, right? Doctors of study. Um, they so there's two people who can explain what the law does, right? One is the law itself, the other is the doctors. And there's a preference being given to the law explaining itself rather than the doctors explaining what it means. I think the hypocritical part's probably and it's interesting, right? But it suggests that they don't practice what they preach at some level, right? So
Yeah. Hmm. That's I'm gonna have to look into that. Someone will have to be smarter than me, as usual, and fill me in. Someone will, no doubt. That again, the very specific thing, less important to hit for like the big idea. The bigger thing they have here is sort of how this paragraph ends, and to reread. But all that, the development of the democratic signified or the wrapping of the despotic signifier in this blah, blah, blah. Nevertheless, it ultimately forms part of the same question, sometimes open, sometimes barred, the same extended abstraction, a repressive machinery that always moves us away from desiring machines. For there's never been but one state. The question, we'll get to that in Erstadt. I'm not going over what one state is. The question, what is the use of that? Fades more and more. This is the question that they're talking about. Like, what's the use of that? Why do we have that law? What's the point? It fades more and more. It disappears in a fog of pessimism, of nihilism. Very particularly the way that they're phrasing this. I think that part is actually pretty self-explanatory on its own. Yeah, I think so. I also don't know the reference for nada nada. I mean, I know what it means, but there's always references in all this shit, the stuff I've never read. I think Roger knew this one last time and I forgot, and I never looked it up because I'm an ass. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. All right. Questions. Let's talk about it. There's a lot in here. Where are you getting stuck? Where do you want to talk more? What comments do you have? What thoughts do you have? Let me know. I'll leave it awkwardly open for a moment. Happy to.
That last repetition of the word nada, was that what, wasn't the reference, is that reference to Hemingway?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think he describes something like that. It was a reference to nihilism, right?
Hmm. I don't know. If it's Hemingway, then it wouldn't it be a comment? So like if it's Hemingway, then it's a clean, well lighted place, because that would be the famous blasphemy of where he replaces God with nada. Actually, that may work. That may actually be accurate. God damn it. That actually could be maybe 2 seconds. I'll find the passage. Uh, it was only that and light was all it needed, and certain cleanliness and order. Some lived in it, never felt it, but knew it was all nada, y puis nada, y nada, y puis nada. Are nada, who art in nada, nada be thy name. Thy kingdom nada, thy will be nada, and nada as it is in nada. Give us this nada our daily nada, and nada us our nada, as we nada our nadas, and nada us not into nada, but deliver us from nada, puis nada. Hail nothing, full of nothing, nothing with thee. It's actually Hemingway. That's not me fucking around or some weird shit. It's actually Hemingway. That actually fits what they're talking about here, because that's about the pessimism of how meaningless life is and how little any of the things they do matter. Yeah, actually. Oh, fuck. That actually might be it. That would be interesting if that was it. It is capitalized. That may not be it, though. Maybe overreading it. I'm going to pretend that was really it, though, because it seems cool if that's a fucking deep cut. Deep cut. I'll post the text in here. If no one else has anything, I'm going to move on to the next paragraph, maybe.
I guess maybe to flesh out more of this paragraph.
Please do. I'm going to use the restroom while you do that, so please do. It would be a perfect
Sure.
break for me. Thank you very much, Jack.
Anytime, buddy. Yeah, so this is about how action and passivity get connected, right? And what that means for both of them, right? Because it's, again, it's the despot as Socius against the earth as Socius. It's overcoding against coding, right? So like when I read this, like this point about Nietzsche, punishment become a vengeance, right? So that with action, right, what the theater of cruelty was doing is it was creating action. It was miraculating, if you like, right? It was using a schizophrenic use. Whereas we have a paranoiac use, paradoxically in vengeance, but in passivity, right? Because it's condensing what can be done and it's condensing the doing of it, right? So we have exclusive disjunctions here as opposed to intense, as opposed to inclusive. So the way they explain that, right, is the quantity of freedom, right? It's as though it's been expelled from the world and made latent under uh, the hammer blows and artist violence, right? So like artisanship, craftsmanship, the violence of artists, right? It's as though action has become passive in, say, craftsmanship, in the arts, and so forth, not in the law per se. There occurs, so this is where they're working out more of the transcendence, right? There occurs a detachment and elevation of the death instinct. So notice it's like that, it's like the language of lack again, um, which ceases to be coded in the interplay of savage actions and reactions. Just pausing there, right? So action and the death instinct are being linked here, albeit it seems through a kind of miraculation, which is going to be contrasted to how passivity works with the death instinct in order to become the somber agent of overcoding. So the death instinct does is an agent of overcoding. It does overcoding here. And this is where they go back to the phallus, right? The detached object that hovers over each subject, right? So we're talking about lack here, basically. Um, but we're talking about the first paralogism specifically now, as though the social machine had come unstuck from its desiring machines. Death, the desire of desire. So the desire of desire here is a kind of death. The desire of the despot's desire is a kind of death, right? The latency, so the activity um, underneath the passivity, right? The kind of potential of it without being actually enacted um, is coming through here, right? Going back to the bowels, right? So it's back to this language of the anus that does the castration. So in that sense, right, we're going back to the first paralogism, the creation of lack now, to talk about how the theater of cruelty now gives way to the theater of terror, which is a way of saying that the death instinct here creates a kind of passivity. So we might think of petrification, right? We might think of impotence, where there's a potential to do, and yet it's impotent. It's not going to actually um, go anywhere. It's just going to stay kind of like lightning in a bottle, right? It's going to remain kind of trapped, or as they say, right, it's going to become latent. It's going to come out as kind of like a secondary piece of what's going on in production, right? And they're connecting this to lack. Um, this is because no other necessity. Right, and then they're walking into overcoding. Go ahead, did I hear somebody on mute?
So the latency of latency of death is a kind of repressive agent, isn't it? So it's the socialist, the despotic socialist, takes over this death instinct and uses it as an agent of repression, so that transforms it into from a natural desire of which is a the death instinct was a natural desire, but it becomes under the despotic becomes the desire of the despotic.
Yeah, so it's I appreciate you honing in on this. So the death instinct is common to both socii here, right? The primitive uses the death instinct as part of creating action, right? So the theater of cruelty is using the death instinct here. Codification is making use of the death instinct, right? And in that sense, it's against decoded and uncoded flows, right? The great fear of all these the first two socii, but it's seemingly a kind of imminent use here, because what's going to change is the death instinct becomes transcendent through through lack and through the law of the father, or said differently, since we love metonymy, through the first and second paralogisms. So we see two different uses of the death drive, one by which there's an active use and one by which there's a passive use, both of which affect the decoded and the uncoded. And in the case of the passive, we add to that, it affects the coded. So like the alliances, the debt will take on a kind of impotence here. Whereas for the earth, they would take on a kind of activity.
I actually think we're not going to move on, by the way, because I don't even think I can finish the next paragraph and do even a moderately decent sort of version of that soon. So, yeah.
That's
Um,
right. There's enough meat in here to kind of dwell from, the
there is,
remainder of the time.
there is, there's a lot happening. What did I miss? And what questions? What is there?
Well, I guess I'd throw it back to JK, responding to your point about like what the death drive is doing in these two cases.
Um,
Yeah. So
yeah.
I was honing in on the word latency, and that he uses that word latency quite a bit. And instead of a death drive, death instinct being a kind of spontaneous, part of the process of desire, it reaches a state of latency, which is because it's taken over by the despotic desire and transforms it into transforms the death drive, death instinct into its agent. And I think is that where the latency comes from?
Uh, yeah, so a transcendent use of the death drive makes the general use of the so it affects the general use of the death drive, right? So it's creating a conflict between the two, right? So that lack and the law of the Father um, make transcendent use of the death drive to affect the codes, whereas the primitive is using the death drive um, with codes and to basically stave off like the decodings. So the transcendent use just adds in um, how codes are now being affected in tandem with all that, which gives you the latency, right? The activity of the primitive becomes latent to the transcendent passivity.
So it's the decoding and then the recoding that causes the latency, right, to occur.
The overcoding to the coding,
Right, right. Overcoding and yeah. So
both
is
of
that
which want to stop decoding, right?
right, right, right. So are you using is it territorialization and deterritorialization? Are they, is that are they similar and are they, are they correlative or parallel activities?
Like what
It
is
seems
territorialization? Is that the question?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it seems like deterritorialization and decoding are they similar, processes? And then recoding and reterritorialization.
We're right now, we aren't really at this point discussing uh, deterritorialization or reterritorialization. This is much more about overcoding, I think would be probably a way to put it, because the codes of the earth that were sort of developed that have now become hardened as inscriptions taken place, the despot doesn't have ownership over them. And again, as words are spoken or edicts given or laws handed out, the complexity of various elements of code just don't work because they allow, again, now that we don't have the earth, the eminent sort of grabbing of desire, we don't have the earth sort of utilizing the germinative flux. These elements are now out, and they need to be placed. So when we sort of have these sort of codes sitting out there, they need to be brought to heel. They need to be brought within uh, the metonymic or metaphorical structure, which means they need to be overcoded by other things. They need to be overcoded by when the king says, "Thou shalt kill none of my animals." He means he doesn't really care about flies. He cares about deer. Like there's there's fuzziness to these things, metaphorical, metonymical rules that are implemented in this process. And this is a little bit different because this is now overcoding the other codes. We're not quite at how deterritorialization or reterritorialization work because this is much more from the space of signifier signified, which is not where deterritorialization occurs.
And you want to be careful too, right? Because notice it's not against intentionality, or rather, it doesn't include like the author's intention.
Say that again.
Like it's not about the intention of the author, right? It's not like it's like the signs function on their own. They don't function by way of an author. But otherwise, yeah, I think I agree with you. Like, I think territoriality is going to take us kind of outside this paragraph for a bit.
Well, it takes us outside of despotic. So there is sort of a grand territorialization that happens due to the socialists, but it's important to remember like how they mean this. And again, this is a deeply material thing we're talking about. Territorialization, deterritorialization, reterritorialization happens upon concretes, happens upon like, I don't want to say things themselves, but like concrete objects as a thing. Recoding, decoding happens on representations. It's a very different place sort of in the process. So if we're talking about overcoding, or we're talking about the space of how the edict is given, and so now we have the word that means the thing, like with the example of the Akkadian and water, where it's like, is that, what is that? Oh, that's water. Now we have this weird, really strange signification. We have a space of representation that plays differently. What the king says something is, it is. It doesn't, like, that's it, and it means it grandly. It means it metonymically and metaphorically. And this is overcoding. This is specifically the space of representation. Concrete things aren't part really of this process, not in the same way that they will come to be, or they were. Now we are in a very different space because of how the written / spoken word operates alongside the power structure. Like the codes that were made in the earth, for example. They're fudgy, funny, fuzzy things that a gourd, which is a gourd, it's a gourd, but if it's tattooed on a woman in a specific tribe, when someone sees that gourd, they don't go gourd. They also don't go fertile. They're aware of the interplay contingently of that signifying element. So it's coded in a lot of different ways. The code operates in a lot of ways, but it's again not dealing with the concrete. We're not playing in that space. It's still representational in a way. As we make our way to the next step, now that gourd is just a fucking gourd because that's what the king says, and all women are his anyway. So that woman, like, contingency is removed, meaning purely exists in this representational space. So now we need to overcode all the original codes with what the despot says or what he demands. Does that make sense? JK? Is that acceptable?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah,
That's yeah.
it's a lot. And it's again, very often it's one of the leaps it took me, I think, halfway through the first reading we did of this before I really started to understand what they were doing here. When we talk about a materialist psychiatry, they're not doing it in some cutesy way of, oh, it's the psychiatry is materialist, but we're going to talk about ideas. No, like they're deeply materialist in everything they're talking about. And this means words that are used, how they're built, how the unconscious operates, how everything happens has a material element to it, is material. And so when we talk about sort of how a despot works, it's not just material conditions in the classic Marxist sense in terms of production, but it's the material unconscious and reality that is sort of building and folding in all of these elements, that is through desire as sort of the element of it, and desiring machines that are producing it. Everything is material through that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great.
Awesome. But with that, that's 2 hours. This has been lovely, 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 lovely. As always, we will see you all next week. I'll be ready. This end of this week, I'm actually going to start doing more streams. I'm trying to do this more regularly. I enjoy it too much, and I haven't properly dedicated time to it. So we're going to see what happens with that. It'll be fun. So be watching this space. We'll be seeing what goes on. But thank you guys for joining, and we will talk to all of you soon enough. Good stuff.
All right.